They say fear of heights starts around 20 feet. At 200 feet, it's not fear anymore. It's a negotiation with gravity. A Douglas fir in the Pacific Northwest could stand as tall as a modern 20-story building, its trunk wider than a car, its top swaying in winds you couldn't even feel on the forest floor. And men in the early 1900s didn't just cut these giants from the ground. Some of them climbed straight up the trunks with nothing but iron spikes on their boots, a leather belt around the tree, and the hope that their hands wouldn't slip. Imagine this. It's 1910 in western Washington. The rain has been falling for days. The ground is a churned mess of mud, bark, and sawdust. Steam donkeys from Washington Iron Works scream in the distance, their boilers hissing and clanking. Axes ring, cross-cut saws rasp through timber that's been alive since before the American Revolution. Down here, everything is chaos and noise. Up there, 150, 180, 200 feet above it all, is where the real gamble starts. Because before you can drag logs, before you can run high-lead cables, before you can turn forest into money, someone has to climb a living skyscraper and turn it into a machine. Modern workers complain if the office elevator is out of order and they have to take the stairs a few floors. Today, a tower climber clips into 3 separate safety points and signs a stack of paperwork before going up a cellular mast. A climbing harness has more certification stamps than an airplane wing. In the 1900s Pacific Northwest, there was no harness rated for anything, no redundant lines, no safety inspector. A high climber's fall protection system was a leather climbing belt, a pair of gaffs strapped to his boots, and experience. If that failed, there was no second chance. The ground did not forgive. The problem was simple and brutal. The logging companies needed a way to move gigantic logs through terrain so steep and tangled that horses and wagons were useless. Rivers couldn't reach every canyon. Roads didn't exist yet. So loggers turned the forest against itself. They chose the biggest, straightest tree in a patch, stripped its branches, and transformed it into a living tower called a spar tree. From its top, they hung steel cables, blocks, and rigging that could lift and swing logs through the air like pendulums of wood and iron. To build that system, someone had to go up first. That someone was the high climber. He wasn't just another man in the crew. In the camps of the Pacific Northwest, the high climber sat at the top of the food chain, right under the foreman. He earned more money, took more risk, and carried more respect than almost anyone else in the woods. He was part athlete, part acrobat, part executioner. The rest of the crew cut, hauled, and rigged. He went where nobody else dared to go, into the empty air above the canopy. If you walked into a camp around Gray's Harbor, the Olympic Peninsula, or the logging towns near the Humptilips River, you'd hear stories about these men told in the bunkhouses late at night. Stories of climbs that seemed impossible. Stories of falls that happened so fast nobody even had time to shout. From the company's perspective, climbing 200-foot trees wasn't insanity. It was engineering by necessity. A well-rigged spar tree meant faster yarding, fewer hang-ups, and more logs at the landing. That meant more lumber on the trains, more money in the mill, more profit back in the city offices in Seattle or Portland. On paper, it was just a line of numbers. Out here, it was a man with spikes on his feet, hugging wet bark, staring at a sky that got closer with every step, and knowing a single misjudged move would turn him into a broken shape at the base of the tree. Today, if you want to reach 200 feet, you ride an elevator, climb a steel tower with rung spacing designed by an engineer, or strap into a helicopter. You sign waivers, you watch safety videos. Someone hands you a reflective vest and a hard hat. In 1900, there were none of those buffers. High climbers invented their own techniques on the fly. They used the same principles of friction, leverage, and weight distribution that modern safety manuals preach. But they learned them through scars, not diagrams. Every camp in the Pacific Northwest was a small laboratory in applied physics, where failure meant a funeral. The forest itself made the job worse. These weren't clean, park-like groves. Old-growth Douglas fir Western red cedar and Sitka spruce grew in dense stands, their lower trunks slick with moss and rain, their upper branches tangled in a green cathedral that blocked out the sky. The bark was rough and fibrous, but could peel in thick strips, sending a climber's gaffs skidding. The trunks swayed, not a gentle movement, but a slow, powerful arc that could throw a man off balance if he didn't learn to move with it. On still days, the trees stood like a column of stone. On windy days, the top of a 200-foot fir could swing several feet in either direction, while the base hardly moved at all. Down below, the crew looked up and saw a silhouette getting smaller as it climbed into the mist. They knew exactly what was at stake. If the high climber made it, the whole operation would run smoother. If he didn't, the job stopped. The mood darkened, and everyone was reminded how thin the line between work and death really was. Yet every morning, as long as there were trees standing and contracts to fill, someone strapped on the spikes and stepped up to the next giant. To us, used to touch screens and drones, the idea of climbing 200 feet on a living tree with nothing but muscle and iron sounds insane. But for the loggers of the early 1900s in the Pacific Northwest, it was just another job that had to be done before the whistle blew and the cables started screaming. The impossible became routine not because it was safe, but because there was no other way. They didn't advertise for high climbers in the newspapers. You didn't fill out an application or attend an interview. You either had the nerve or you didn't, and the only way to prove it was to strap on the gear, pick a tree, and start climbing while the rest of the crew watched to see if you'd make it or fall. Most high climbers came from somewhere else first. Some were sailors who'd spent years climbing ship, rigging in storms, men who understood rope, balance, and the feeling of working 100 feet above a deck that was already moving. Others were ex-riggers from construction sites back east, men who'd walked steel beams on bridges or hung iron on skyscrapers before those jobs paid enough to keep them. A few were just loggers who'd watched the previous high climber work and thought, I could do that. And then they did, or they tried. Not everyone who went up came down the same way they started. In the camps around Forks, Aberdeen, and the Willapa Hills, high climbers were a breed apart. They ate at the same long tables, slept in the same bunkhouses, but everyone knew they operated under different rules. A faller who made a bad cut might destroy a log. A high climber who made a bad move destroyed himself. The pay reflected that reality. While a typical logger might make $3 or $4 a day, a high climber could pull in $6, $7, even $10 for a single climb, depending on the height and the danger. That was real money in an era when a steak dinner cost a quarter, and you could rent a room for $1 a night. But money wasn't why most of them did it, or at least not the only reason. There was something else, a kind of pride that came from doing a job nobody else could do, from standing at the top of a 200-foot spar tree, looking out over miles of unbroken forest, and knowing you'd just conquered something that would kill most men who tried. It was the same impulse that drives people to climb mountains or dive to the ocean floor. Except here, it wasn't a hobby. It was Tuesday. The gear was brutally simple. If you'd seen a high climber's kit laid out on a bunk, you'd think it was incomplete. That something was missing, but nothing was missing. That was everything. First, the climbing spurs. Companies like Klein and Buckingham had been making them since the 1890s, originally for telephone linemen, but loggers adapted them fast. Also called gaffs, spikes, or tree climbers depending on which camp you were in and who was doing the talking. These were steel spikes roughly 2 inches long, curved slightly, sharpened to a brutal point. Each spike was welded or riveted onto a steel shank that strapped to the outside of the climber's boot with leather straps and buckles. The fit had to be perfect. Too loose and the whole assembly would shift mid-climb, throwing off your balance or worse, letting the gaff pull out of the tree. Too tight, your foot went numb, your toes cramped, and you lost the fine control you needed to feel the wood through the spike. The spikes themselves were simple physics. Drive the point into the bark, into the sapwood beneath, and your weight keeps it locked in place. As long as you're pushing into the tree, friction and leverage hold you. The instant you pull away or shift your weight wrong, the spike comes free. It's the same principle that keeps an ice axe buried in a glacier or a piton wedged in a rock crack, except with an ice axe, you've got a rope. With a gaff 150 feet up a wet fir tree, you've got nothing but the other spike and a belt. In 1914, A climber near Raymond, Washington, learned this the hard way. His name was Carl Lindstrom, 28 years old, 3 years of climbing experience. He was 120 feet up a red cedar when his left gaff hit a pitch pocket, a hidden void in the wood filled with resin. The spike punched straight through, found nothing solid, and slipped. His right leg took all his weight for maybe half a second. Then that spike pulled out too. He dropped 12 feet before his belt caught him, slamming him back into the trunk so hard it cracked 2 ribs and knocked the wind out of him. He hung there, gasping, boots dangling, while the crew below screamed at him to reset his spikes. It took him 5 minutes to get his feet back under him, 5 minutes swinging in the air, knowing that if the belt failed, he was gone. He finished the climb, topped the tree, came down, never climbed again, sold his spikes to the next man, and went back to falling timber on solid ground. The belt, God, the belt. Modern climbers wear harnesses engineered by people with degrees in materials science. They've got leg loops, waist support, padded sections, multiple attachment points, buckles rated to hold thousands of pounds, and tags that tell you exactly when the thing expires. A high climber's belt in 1910 was a loop of leather, thick leather, sure, good leather, tanned and oiled and stitched by hand, often by local saddle makers or harness shops in towns like Aberdeen or Hoquiam, but still just leather, maybe 3 inches wide, long enough to wrap around the tree trunk with some overlap, with a heavy buckle or a snap link to close the loop. You wore it around your waist or hips depending on personal preference and body type. When you climbed, you flipped the belt around the tree, pulled it snug, and leaned back into it. Your weight pressed you into the belt, and the belt pressed against the tree. As long as the loop held and the buckle didn't fail, you stayed attached. That was the theory. In practice, the belt was your lifeline, your handhold, and your only connection to something other than air. If the leather rotted, if the stitching gave out, if the buckle bent or snapped, you were gone. Some climbers carried a backup belt, coiled over one shoulder. Others didn't bother. The logic was simple. If your primary belt failed, you probably wouldn't have time to deploy a second one anyway. You'd already be falling. But the ones who carried backup belts weren't superstitious. They were practical. They'd seen belts fail. In wet weather, leather absorbed moisture, stretched, weakened. In dry heat, it cracked. Pitch and tree sap degraded the fibers over time. A belt might hold fine for 6 months, then snap on the 7th climb without warning. Smart climbers checked their gear every morning, flexed the leather, looked for cracks, felt for soft spots. The ones who didn't check didn't last long. The technique of climbing was a rhythm, a dance between spikes and belt that had to become second nature because thinking too hard about it would slow you down or get you killed. You start at the base. The tree trunk is enormous down here, maybe 8 or 10 feet across on a big Douglas fir. You can't get your belt around that, so the first 20 or 30 feet, you're climbing without the belt entirely, just gaffs and grip. You hug the tree like you're trying to strangle it. Drive the right spike in, shift your weight, drive the left spike in, pull yourself up. Right spike, left spike, stab and pull, stab and pull. Your arms do most of the work at this stage, wrapping around the trunk, finding handholds in the bark, pulling your body weight upward while your legs push off the spikes. It's exhausting. Your forearms burn, your shoulders scream, sweat pours down your back even in the cold, because you're doing a full-body workout on a vertical surface with no rest. But you keep going because stopping this low makes you look weak, and looking weak in a logging camp means you don't get the job next time. Once you're high enough that the tree is tapered to maybe 3 or 4 feet in diameter, you can finally get the belt around it. You pull the belt off your shoulder, flip it around the tree behind you, catch the loose end, and buckle it closed. Now you've got your lifeline. Now you can lean back into the belt. Take some of the weight off your arms, and let the leather do part of the work. From here, the rhythm changes. Spike, step, flip, spike, step, flip. You drive the gaff into the tree. You step up, transferring your weight onto that leg. You flip the belt higher up the trunk, rebuckle it if necessary, and lean back. Then the other leg. Spike, step, flip, over and over. Each movement has to be deliberate but not slow. Slow means you tire out before you reach the top. Fast means you get sloppy, and sloppy means you die. The tree itself is not a static object. The bark is uneven, scarred, sometimes soft with rot in patches you can't see until your gaff punches through and finds nothing solid. There are knots, burls, places where branches used to be, and left hard lumps that deflect your spike at the wrong angle. There are pitch pockets that ooze sticky resin onto your boots, your hands, your belt, making everything slippery. And there's the taper. As you climb higher, the trunk gets narrower. Your belt cinches tighter. Your spikes have less wood to bite into. The tree starts to sway. There's a moment every climber remembers, usually happens around 80 to 90 feet. You've been climbing for 20 minutes. Your rhythm is solid. Your confidence is building. And then a gust of wind hits the canopy, and the whole tree shifts sideways. Not much, maybe 6 inches. But when you're clinging to a vertical surface, with nothing but steel points and wood, 6 inches feels like 6 feet. Your stomach drops. Your hands tighten on the belt. Every muscle locks up. The tree sways back. You're okay. You're still attached. But for those 2 seconds, your brain screamed that you were falling. That's when you find out if you're built for this work. Some men freeze, can't move, can't climb higher, can't climb down. The crew has to talk them through it, coax them down, foot by foot. Those men don't climb again. The ones who push through, who take a breath and keep climbing, those are the ones who become high climbers. At 100 feet, you're above the canopy of most of the surrounding trees. You can see the forest spread out in every direction, an ocean of green broken only by the occasional scar of a clear cut, or the thin line of a railroad snaking through the valleys. The wind hits you now. Down on the ground, the air might be still, sheltered by the dense timber. Up here, the wind is constant. It pushes against you, pulls at your clothes, makes the tree sway in slow, sickening arcs. At 150 feet, the trunk is maybe 2 feet across, narrow enough that your belt barely fits around it. Narrow enough that when the wind gusts, the whole top of the tree bends like a fishing rod. You feel it in your gut. The world tilts. Your inner ear screams. You tighten your grip on the belt, press your spikes deeper, and wait for the sway to settle. Then you climb higher. At 200 feet, you're in a different world. The air is thinner, or at least it feels that way, because every breath comes hard from the exertion and the fear you're not allowed to show. The tree trunk is barely thicker than a telephone pole now. The bark is younger up here, smoother, and your spikes don't bite as deep. The sway is constant. 3 feet to the left, 3 feet to the right. A slow pendulum that never stops. You move with it. You have to. Fighting the movement just tires you out faster. You look down once, just once, not because you want to, but because some part of your brain demands to know how far you've come. The ground is a distant abstraction. The men below are the size of ants. The logs stacked at the landing look like matchsticks. If you fell from here, you'd have nearly 4 seconds to think about it before you hit. 4 seconds is a long time when you're dying. But you don't fall, not today. You've done this before. You'll do it again tomorrow. You're a high climber. This is what you do. The physical toll was immense. A single climb could take an hour or more, depending on the height of the tree and the condition of the bark. Your legs cramped from the constant flexing and stepping. Your hands went numb from gripping the belt. Your back ached from leaning into the leather for an hour straight. And once you reached the top, the job wasn't over. That's when the real work began. But before we get to that, understand this. Every high climber knew men who'd fallen. They'd seen it happen or heard the stories. A gaff that pulled out on a patch of rotten wood. A belt buckle that snapped under load. A moment of inattention. A wasp's sting. A sudden cramp that made a man jerk and lose his footing. Sometimes the body was recovered. Sometimes it wasn't, lost in the thick brush and slash below. And the crew just marked the spot and kept working. In the modern world, we build systems to prevent disaster. Redundancies, backups, fail-safes. The high climbers of the early 1900s had one system: don't screw up. And for a lot of them, that was enough. For the others, there are unmarked graves in the forests of Washington and Oregon, And trees that nobody talks about. You've just spent an hour climbing 200 feet of wet fir. Your legs are shaking. Your hands are raw. The tree is swaying beneath you like a ship in a storm. And now comes the part that separates the high climbers from the men who just thought they could be high climbers. Now you have to cut off the top of the tree. While you're standing on it, the topping saw was a crosscut saw, but smaller than the monsters the fallers used on the ground. Companies like Atkins, Simons, and Diston made them, originally for bucking logs into manageable sections, but climbers adapted them for work at height. Maybe 3 or 4 feet long, light enough to carry strapped across your back during the climb, heavy enough that after an hour of hauling it up, it felt like you'd been carrying an anvil. Some climbers preferred a 2-man saw cut down and modified for solo use. Others used a purpose-built topping saw with handles on both ends so they could work it alone. Either way, the principle was the same. You were about to saw through the very thing you were standing on. Pause. Here's how it worked. And pay attention, because this is where physics and courage had to meet in perfect balance, or you'd be dead before you hit the 3rd branch down. You'd shimmy around the trunk until you were positioned on the side you wanted the top to fall. That decision mattered. If you cut wrong, if the top fell toward you or wrapped around the trunk, it could take you with it, or slam you into the tree hard enough to knock you loose. So you read the lean. You watched which way the upper branches hung. You felt the wind. You made a guess. An educated guess, sure, but still a guess, because trees don't follow blueprints. Then you'd make your cuts. Just like felling a tree on the ground, you started with an undercut, a notch on the side you wanted the top to fall toward. You'd pull the topping saw across the trunk, working it back and forth, the teeth biting into wood that was younger and denser than the old-growth timber below. Sawdust rained down, sticking to the pitch on your gloves, coating your face, getting in your eyes. You couldn't wipe it away because both hands were on the saw. You just blinked it out and kept cutting. The undercut had to be deep enough to guide the fall, but not so deep you weakened the tree prematurely. Too shallow and the top wouldn't fall clean. Too deep and it might snap before you were ready, before you'd started the back cut, and then you were riding a 40-foot whip of wood and branches as it tore away. Once the undercut was done, you'd move around to the opposite side, still strapped to the tree with your belt, still standing on your spikes which were now driven into a trunk you were actively cutting through, and you'd start the back cut. This is the cut that would sever the tree. Every stroke of the saw brought you closer to the moment when the top would go. You could feel it through the blade. The wood would start to creak. A low groan that you felt in your chest more than heard. The tree was talking to you, telling you it was about to let go. Modern arborists have hydraulic lifts, chainsaws with safety chains, and rigging systems that let them lower sections of a tree in controlled pieces. A high climber in 1910 had a handsaw, a leather belt, and the knowledge that in about 10 seconds, the top 40 feet of this tree was going to snap off and fall, and he was going to be attached to what was left. Pause. The snap, when it came, was loud, not a crack like a gunshot, more like a deep, splintering tear, the sound of wood fibers ripping apart under tension. The top would lean, hesitate for a fraction of a second, and then go. 40 feet of Douglas fir, branches, needles, maybe a ton or more of wood, tipping away from the climber and crashing down through the canopy below. The sound it made hitting the ground was like thunder. The impact shook the forest floor hard enough that men 100 yards away could feel it through their boots. But the climber wasn't watching the top fall. He was hanging on. Because when a 40-foot section of tree snaps off, the remaining trunk doesn't just stand there politely. It whips. The sudden release of weight at the top sends a shock wave down the length of the spar. The whole tree bends, flexes, and then snaps back like a release spring. The climber, strapped to the trunk 200 feet up, gets thrown sideways, forward, back, in a violent oscillation that can last 10 or 15 seconds. This is the moment when men fell, not during the climb, not during the cutting, but in those few seconds after the top came off, when the tree was bucking like an animal trying to shake off a rider. If your belt slipped, if your spikes pulled out, if you panicked and let go, you were gone. The high climbers who survived learned to ride it out. Knees bent, body loose, moving with the sway instead of fighting it. Like riding a horse. or surfing a wave. You couldn't control it. You could only hold on and wait for the motion to dampen. When the tree finally settled, the climber would take a breath, maybe the first real breath he'd taken in 5 minutes. He'd check his gear, make sure the belt was still solid, make sure the spikes were still seated. Then he'd look up at what was left. The top of the tree was now a raw, splintered stump. The spar was ready for rigging, and the climber still had to get down. Pause. Let's talk about the men who didn't make it. In 1923, near the town of Kethlamet in southwestern Washington, a high climber named Martin Erickson was topping a Sitka spruce estimated at 210 feet. Erickson was experienced. He'd been climbing for 6 years. He knew the trees, knew the gear, knew the risks. But on this particular day, the wind was gusting harder than usual. The foreman should have called it off. He didn't. Contracts had deadlines. Logs had to move. Erickson made it to the top, made his cuts. The top fell clean. But when the tree whipped back, something failed. Maybe the belt, maybe a spike pulled loose, maybe he just lost his grip. Witnesses on the ground said he fell silently, didn't scream, didn't shout, just came off the tree and dropped like a stone. His body hit a pile of slash 200 feet below. The impact killed him instantly. The crew pulled his body out, wrapped it in canvas, and sent word to his wife in town. The company paid for the funeral. 2 days later, another climber topped the same tree. The work didn't stop. In the camps around Forks, there was a high climber named Thomas Haywood, who fell in 1917 and lived. Barely. He was 180 feet up a red cedar when his belt buckle snapped. The leather had rotted where it folded through the buckle, weakened by months of rain and pitch and stress. When the buckle let go, Haywood dropped about 30 feet before a branch caught him, broke his fall just enough that when he hit the next branch, and then the next, tumbling through the canopy like a rag doll, he didn't die. He broke both legs, shattered his pelvis, cracked half a dozen ribs, and punctured a lung. They carried him out on a stretcher made of fir, poles, and canvas. He spent 4 months in a hospital in Aberdeen. He never climbed again. But he lived. That made him lucky. These weren't isolated incidents. Every camp had stories. Every crew knew someone who'd fallen or knew someone who knew someone. The companies kept records, clinical and cold. Worker deceased, cause, fall from height. That was it. No investigation, no safety review. The next day, another man would strap on the spikes because the job had to be done, and there were always men willing to do it. Why? Why take that risk? Today we have trouble understanding that kind of calculus. We wear seatbelts to drive to the grocery store. We put helmets on kids riding bicycles. We've built an entire civilization around the idea that risk should be minimized, managed, and if possible, eliminated. But in the logging camps of the Pacific Northwest in the early 1900s, risk wasn't something you avoided. It was something you accepted, because the alternative was poverty. No work meant no money. No money meant no food, no shelter, no future. Men took dangerous jobs not because they were reckless, but because they were practical. A high climber could make enough in a season to support a family for a year. A dead high climber left behind a widow and kids, sure. But a man who refused to climb left behind a family that starved slowly instead of quickly. And there was something else. Something harder to quantify. A sense of pride, of capability, of being able to do something most men couldn't. In a world where your value was measured by what you could produce, by how much you could endure, being a high climber meant something. It meant you were tougher, braver, more skilled than the men on the ground. That might not mean much in a modern office, but in a logging camp where respect was earned with blood and sweat, it meant everything. Pause. Life in the camps was its own kind of ordeal. These weren't comfortable base camps with hot showers and catered meals. These were rough, temporary settlements carved out of the wilderness, designed to house men for a season and then be abandoned when the timber ran out. The bunkhouses were long, low buildings made of raw lumber, tar paper, and desperation. 50 men to a building. Bunks stacked 2 high, sometimes 3 if space was tight. No privacy, and no heat except for a single wood stove in the center that created the same problem every bunkhouse had. Roasting near the stove. Freezing near the walls. The smell was indescribable. Wet wool, Unwashed bodies, tobacco smoke, kerosene lamps, and the ever-present stench of pitch and sawdust that soaked into everything. The men slept in their work clothes because taking them off meant they'd be cold and damp in the morning. Laundry was something you did in a creek on Sunday if you had the energy. Most didn't bother. You just wore the same clothes until they rotted off your back. Then you bought new ones from the company store, which sold everything at twice the price you'd pay in town, and deducted it from your wages. Food was fuel, nothing more. Breakfast at 4 in the morning. Flapjacks, bacon, beans, coffee strong enough to dissolve a spoon. Lunch was whatever you could carry into the woods. Bread, dried meat, maybe an apple if the supply wagon had come in recently. Dinner was more beans, more bread, occasionally a stew made from whatever the cook could scrounge. Meat when they could get it. Potatoes when they couldn't. The portions were huge because the work burned calories like a furnace. A high climber could easily consume 5,000 or 6,000 calories a day and still lose weight over the course of a season. The camps were isolated, miles from the nearest town. The only connection to the outside world was the railroad spur, or a logging road that turned into a mud pit every time it rained. And in places like Camp Grisdale near Olympia, or the operations up the Bogachiel River, you might as well have been on another planet. Mail came once a week if you were lucky. Supplies came when they came. If the cook ran out of flour, or the blacksmith ran out of steel, you made do or you waited. There were no days off, no weekends. You worked as long as there was daylight and sometimes longer. When weather shut down the operation, heavy snow, ice storms, floods, you sat in the bunkhouse and waited, unpaid, because you only got paid for days you worked. Men died in these camps from more than just falling. Pneumonia killed loggers by the dozen. Infections from cuts and puncture wounds turned deadly in the absence of antibiotics. Men got crushed by logs, cut by saws, burned by steam donkey boilers, drowned in rivers during log drives. The turnover was constant. A crew of 50 men in November might have 20 new faces by February. Some quit. Some got fired. Some got hurt and couldn't work anymore. Some just disappeared into the woods and were never seen again. Yet the work continued, because America needed lumber, needed it for houses, factories, railroads, mine supports, ships, furniture, paper. Every city growing up from the plains, every town spreading across the frontier, was built on timber cut from the forests of the Pacific Northwest. And every board foot of that timber passed through the hands of men who lived in conditions that would horrify a modern worker and accepted risks that would shut down an operation today. The high climbers were the elite of this brutal system. They lived in the same bunkhouses, ate the same food, endured the same isolation. But they carried themselves differently. They knew they were special, knew they did something nobody else could do. And that knowledge, that pride, was worth more than money. It had to be. Because money couldn't buy back the years a man lost to injury, couldn't restore hearing destroyed by steam donkeys and falling timber, couldn't bring back the friends who fell and didn't get up. This was the cost. This was the bargain. Climb the tree, top the spar, rig the cables, move the logs, build the country, whatever it takes, whatever it costs. And if you fall, someone else will strap on your spikes and finish the job. Stand in the forests of the Pacific Northwest today, and you'll see the scars, not the obvious ones, the clear cuts and replanted tree farms that look like green cornrows stretching to the horizon. Look deeper. Walk into the old growth that remains, the scattered patches that somehow escaped the saws, and you'll find them. Spar trees. Still standing after a century. They're easy to spot once you know what you're looking for. A Douglas fir, rising 150 feet into the canopy, perfectly straight, but stripped of branches for the first 100 feet. The bark scarred with notches where climbing spikes bit in thousands of times. The top cut flat decades ago, now weathered and split, hosting a garden of moss and small plants that have taken root in the rotting wood. These are the monuments. The cathedrals left behind by men who climbed into the sky, with nothing but iron and leather. Most people walk past them without a second glance. Also, Just another tree in a forest full of trees. But if you stop, if you look up and try to imagine what it took to climb that height with the gear they had, you start to understand what we've lost. Pause. The age of the high climbers didn't end suddenly. It faded slowly as technology caught up with necessity. By the 1940s, portable steel towers started appearing in logging operations. Companies like Washington Iron Works and Skagit Steel began manufacturing prefabricated spar towers that could be assembled on the ground and raised with a crane. You didn't need to find the perfect tree anymore. You didn't need a man willing to climb 200 feet. You just needed a crew with wrenches and a day to bolt the thing together. It was safer, more consistent, and didn't require skills that took years to develop and could disappear in a single fall. Helicopters changed everything. By the 1960s and 70s, helicopter logging made it possible to pull timber out of terrain that ground-based systems couldn't reach. No need for spar trees, no need for high climbers, just a pilot, a cable, and a chopper that could lift a 10-ton log like it weighed nothing. Faster, cleaner, more efficient, and nobody had to climb 200 feet to make it work. Modern tree climbers still exist. Arborists who trim trees in suburban neighborhoods, researchers who study forest canopies, adventure guides who take tourists on treetop tours. But the work is fundamentally different. Today's climbers wear full-body harnesses made of nylon and Kevlar, rated to hold thousands of pounds of force. They use ascenders, mechanical devices that grip the rope and slide upward but won't slide down. They clip into multiple attachment points, use friction hitches, carry radios, wear helmets with face shields. The entire system is designed with redundancy. If one thing fails, two others catch you. A modern arborist climbing a 100-foot oak tree in someone's backyard has more safety equipment than a high climber in 1910 had climbing a 200-foot fir in a windstorm. That's progress. That's civilization. That's what we've gained. But here's what we've lost. We've lost the expectation that men should be that capable, that they should be able to look at a problem with no easy solution and solve it anyway. We've lost the connection between a worker and his tools, the intimate knowledge that came from depending on a piece of gear so completely that you could feel when it was about to fail. We've lost the pride that came from doing something genuinely difficult and dangerous and doing it well. The high climbers weren't superhuman. They were just men. But they were men who existed in a world that demanded more from them than our world demands from us. They couldn't call for help if things went wrong. They couldn't file a complaint if the conditions were unsafe. They couldn't sue the company if they got hurt. They had two choices: do the job or don't. And if they didn't, someone else would. Today we live in a softer world, a safer world, a world where most of us will never face real physical danger in our work. We sit in chairs. We stare at screens. We worry about deadlines and emails and whether the coffee machine is broken again. And that's fine. That's the world we built. The world that all that timber helped create. But something was traded away to get here. Pause. There are still a few men alive who remember the high climbers, not many. They're in their 80s and 90s now, living in nursing homes and small houses in logging towns that have gone quiet since the mills closed. If you find one and get him talking, he'll tell you stories. Not about heroism or glory. Those words don't come up. He'll tell you about the work, about a man named Jensen or McAllister or O'Brien who could climb faster than anyone else, about a day when the wind was too strong and they should have stayed on the ground but didn't, about a funeral in a town too small to have a proper cemetery. He'll tell you that the high climbers didn't think they were doing anything special. It was just the job, and when pressed, when you ask what made a good high climber, he'll think for a minute and then say something simple. He didn't fall. That was it. That was the measure of success. You climbed the tree, you topped it, you rigged it, and you came down alive. Do that enough times and you were good at your job. Fail once and you were a name in a ledger and a story told in a bunkhouse. The forests themselves remember. The spar trees that still stand are witnesses. Every scar in the bark, every notch where a spike bit deep, is a record. A map of a climb that happened decades ago, made by a man whose name nobody remembers, but whose work is still visible if you know where to look. The forest floor remembers, too. Walk through old growth in the Olympic Peninsula or the Cascade foothills, and you'll find cable, rusted steel cable from companies like Willamette Ironworks and Lidgerwood Manufacturing, half buried in moss and ferns, stretching between rotted stumps. This was the rigging, the high lead system that made it all work. The cables are breaking down now, oxidizing back into iron oxide, returning to the earth. In another century, they'll be gone entirely. But for now, they're still there, evidence of a system that moved mountains of timber through impossible terrain using nothing but steam, steel, and men willing to climb. There are museums now. Logging museums in towns like Forks and Aberdeen and Cottage Grove. They have displays of old gear. Klein climbing spurs come mounted on wooden plaques. Leather belts cracked and stiff with age. Topping saws with teeth worn smooth. Photographs of crews standing in front of massive trees, the men tiny by comparison, their faces serious, no smiles. These were not men who smiled for cameras. They were men who worked. The museums do their best. They explain the process, show the tools, tell the stories. But they can't convey the reality. They can't make you feel what it was like to be 200 feet up a swaying tree with nothing but spikes and a belt. They can't make you smell the pitch, or hear the wind, or feel the moment when the tree whips and you're holding on with everything you have. History can be recorded, but experience can't be transferred. Pause. So what do we owe them? These men who climbed trees so tall that falling from the top meant you'd have time to think about dying before you hit the ground. These men who built the rigging systems that moved the timber, that built the cities we live in now. We owe them memory. We owe them the effort to understand what they did and why it mattered. We owe them the honesty to admit that the comfortable world we inhabit was built on their backs, on their risks, on their deaths. Every wood frame house in America contains a piece of their legacy. Every floor joist, every wall stud, every roof rafter was once a tree that men like them brought down. The lumber didn't appear magically in a store. It was cut, hauled, milled, and shipped by men who worked in conditions we can barely imagine and accepted dangers we've spent a century trying to eliminate. We owe them respect, not pity. They didn't want pity then, and they don't need it now. They made their choices with open eyes. They knew the risks. They climbed anyway. That deserves respect. And maybe, just maybe, we owe them the humility to recognize that we're not better than they were. We're safer, yes. More comfortable, absolutely. We have better tools, better knowledge, better systems. But strip all that away, put us in their boots with their gear and their task, and most of us wouldn't last a day. We've built a world that protects us from the need to be as tough as they were. That's progress. But it's also loss. The high climbers weren't mythical figures. They weren't superheroes. They were working men doing a dangerous job for money they needed to survive. They got up in the morning, strapped on their spikes, climbed into the sky, and came back down if they were lucky. Some of them lived long lives. Some of them died young. All of them are gone now. But the trees they climbed are still standing. Scattered through the remaining old-growth forests of Washington and Oregon, you can still find them. Spar trees. Branchless columns rising into the canopy, their tops flat, their bark scarred. Monuments to a generation that looked at the impossible and made it routine. Walk past one, stop, look up. Try to imagine standing at the top of that tree with nothing but a leather belt and a pair of steel spikes between you and a 200-foot fall. Try to imagine making that climb every day for a season, for a year, for a career. Could you do what they did? That's what we lost. That's what we owe. And that's what remains. Written in scars on trees that have outlived the men who climbed them.